911, what's your emergency?
Yeah, this is Max at the old Suncoal station. I was just pumping gas for a lady and there's somebody in the back of her car with a knife.
Linda knew she should wait until morning, but the thought of facing Monday without at least a few hours of sleep made her decision for her. The 3-hour drive from Springfield wasn't ideal in the dark, but she'd done it before. And besides, nighttime traffic would be lighter. You could stay, her sister offered from the doorway. Call in sick tomorrow. Can't afford to, Linda replied as she was already hurrying down the front steps. New job, remember? The autumn night had turned bitter while they had been inside saying their goodbyes. Linda pulled her jacket tighter and quickened her pace across the leaf-strewn driveway to her car, fumbling with her keys in the darkness. A gust of wind sent dead leaves skittering across her feet as she slid behind the wheel, making her jump despite herself. The dark highway seemed to stretch on for miles into nothing but blackness. She had just passed exit 23 when the gas light blinked to life, its orange glow a silent accusation. Shit! Linda gripped the steering wheel tighter. This stretch of highway was notorious, nothing but dense pine forests for miles. Well, almost nothing. There was that old Suncoal station ahead, the one she'd always promised herself she would never stop at. From the road, it looked like something time had forgotten. 2 ancient gas pumps, hunched beneath a fluorescent sign that flickered like a dying firefly. The kind of place that showed up in the opening scene of every horror movie she had ever watched. But tonight, she didn't have a choice. Her dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. as she pulled onto the crumbling concrete. The hours posted on the grimy shop window declared that closing time was at midnight. Through the streaked glass, she could make out the attendant. He was barely out of his teens and already counting down the register. Linda hesitated for a moment, wrestling with the decision. Maybe she could make it to the next station. The gas gauge's needle, though, buried deep in the red, told her that wasn't an option. She caught the attendant's eye and mouthed an apologetic, "Sorry." He responded with a wave and what should have been a welcoming smile, but something made her stomach tighten. His movements were too stiff, mechanical almost. The smile stopped at his lips, leaving his eyes dark and watchful. As he emerged from the shop, each step toward her car was deliberately slow. Linda's hand instinctively moved to the door lock. "Just fill it up, please," Linda said, forcing a smile. "I'm sorry about the time." "No problem at all, ma'am." His words were casual, but something in his tone made her skin prickle. He disappeared behind her car and reappeared at the pump on the passenger side. Linda watched him in the rearview mirror, her unease growing. He seemed to be deliberately avoiding looking at her car, his movements almost theatrical in their casualness. Something about his behavior made her throat tighten. What was he doing? She whispered, her breath fogging the cold window. When he returned to her window, his face was masked with a forced calm, but his eyes kept darting from her face to her car, like a nervous tick. "That'll be $18, ma'am." His voice had changed. It was now taut as a wire. His hands trembled slightly as he took her credit card, his fingers ice cold against hers. "Is everything okay?" The words escaped her before she could stop them. "Yeah, it's just..." He started backing away, still watching her car with strange intensity. "Let me run this inside for you. These old card readers, you know how they are." Linda waited. Above her, the fluorescent lights hummed like angry insects, their harsh glare creating islands of sticky light in the surrounding darkness. Moths battered themselves against the bulbs, their frantic shadows dancing across her windshield like tiny desperate things. When the attendant emerged minutes later, his face was grave. I'm sorry, ma'am, but your card's been declined." "What? That's impossible." Linda's voice rose slightly. "I just paid it off." "Maybe," he glanced at her car again, swallowing hard. "Maybe you should come inside and call the credit card company." The urgency in his voice had evolved into something like desperation. "We've got a phone in the shop." Linda's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every crime show she had ever watched, every warning her mother had ever given her, screamed not to enter an empty shop with a stranger at night. But what could she do? She couldn't just drive away, and she had no cash in her wallet. It held nothing but receipts and loose change. The cheerful chime of the doorbell hadn't finished echoing when Linda heard the heavy click of the door lock engage behind her. She spun around, her heart slamming against her ribs. The attendant immediately raised his hands, palms out. "Ma'am, please," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the buzzing of the fluorescent lights. "Don't scream, I'm trying to help you." He swallowed hard before continuing. "There's someone in your back seat. I saw him there when I was pumping gas. He was lying flat on the floor, and he has a knife. I've already called the police." A nervous laugh bubbled up from Linda's throat, teetering on the edge of hysteria. "Are you kidding me? This has to be some kind of joke." The words died in her mouth as she saw his face. The raw fear in his eyes wasn't fake. He wasn't even looking at her anymore. His gaze was fixed on something through the window, his face draining of color. Linda turned toward the grimy glass, her movements slow and wooden as if in a nightmare. Her car sat beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, looking exactly as she'd left it, and then she saw it. A dark shape uncurling from the floor behind her seat, rising like smoke. The overhead lights caught something in his hand, a flash of metal that made her blood freeze. Her legs dissolved beneath her. The attendant lunged forward, catching her before she hit the floor. He half dragged, half carried her behind the counter as the first distant wail of police sirens cut through the night air. The detective laid out the evidence photos on her kitchen table 3 days later. The hunting knife was first, almost as long as Linda's forearm. Its serrated edges still carried the traces of rust-colored stains from previous victims. Then came the rest. Industrial-strength rope, already cut to precision lengths, duct tape, zip ties, and finally, a wrinkled piece of paper that made Linda's coffee cup slip from her trembling fingers. It was a list of addresses, written in cramped, meticulous handwriting. Her sister's address in Springfield was crossed out in thick black ink. Below it, her own address was circled twice in red. "He had been waiting in your car since Springfield," the detective said quietly. "Watched you say goodbye to your sister. Waited until you were too far from help to..." He left the sentence unfinished. They caught him, of course. Linda sat through the trial, watched them present evidence of other women he'd followed from Springfield over the past 6 months. Some had been luckier than others. These days, Linda doesn't make the drive to Springfield anymore. Her sister visits her instead, and every time she gets into her car, any car, she checks the back seat twice. Sometimes on dark nights, she thinks about the young gas station attendant and wonders what made him look twice in her car, and what made him notice something wasn't right. She sent him a thank you card once, but it felt inadequate for saving her life.